Put your hands where I can see them." The command cut through the late afternoon air like a slammed door, sharp enough to make every conversation on the sidewalk collapse into silence as Ava Johnson froze mid-step, her worn sneakers planted against the cracked concrete just outside the corner store, a paper bag clutched tightly in her hands, the thin plastic handles stretching under the weight of a gallon of milk and a box of cereal. Her fingers trembling slightly, but not enough for anyone to notice unless they were looking closely. Really closely, the way Officer Daniel Brooks was now, his stance wide, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing with authority that didn't need to be explained, his uniform crisp, his badge catching the amber glow of the setting sun as it dipped behind the low buildings lining the street, casting long shadows that stretched between them like a line neither of them had agreed to cross. A police cruiser idling behind him with its lights off but engine humming low, a quiet reminder that power didn't always need noise to be felt. And around them, a small crowd had begun to gather, people slowing their steps, phones half raised, curiosity flickering in their eyes as the tension thickened, the kind that made the air feel heavier, harder to breathe. Ava's heartbeat thudding against her ribs, loud in her ears, louder than the distant traffic, louder than the faint buzz of a street lamp flickering to life above them. But she didn't move, didn't drop the bag, didn't run, even as Brooks tilted his head slightly, studying her with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You think this is funny?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled, edged with something colder than anger, something practiced. Ava swallowed, her throat dry, but her voice, when it came, was steady in a way that surprised even her. "I didn't do anything," she said, the words simple, almost too simple for the weight they carried. Brooks let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if she had just told a joke he'd heard 100 times before. "Yeah, that's what they all say," he replied, glancing briefly at the growing audience before looking back at her, his gaze narrowing. "Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Hands where I can see them." Ava slowly lifted one hand, the plastic bag crinkling softly as the milk shifted inside, the sound oddly loud in the quiet street. Her other hand still gripping the strap of her backpack, the fabric worn thin from years of use, a loose thread brushing against her wrist as the breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and something sweet from the store behind her. And for a moment, just a moment, everything seemed to pause, the world narrowing down to the space between her and the officer, to the distance measured, not in feet but in assumptions, in the way his eyes scanned her, taking in her hoodie, her skin, her stillness, and deciding what it all meant without asking. "You said your mom's on her way, right?" Brooks added, a hint of amusement creeping back into his tone. "Special forces, was it?" A couple of people in the crowd exchanged glances, a quiet ripple of disbelief passing through them, and Brooks chuckled again, louder this time, as if inviting them in on the joke. "Kid, I've heard a lot of stories, but that one?" He let the sentence hang, unfinished, like it didn't deserve to be completed. Ava's jaw tightened, her fingers curling slightly against the plastic handle as she lifted her chin just enough to meet his gaze, her eyes steady despite the fear pressing against her chest. "She is," she said, softer now, but no less certain, the words landing between them with a weight that didn't match her size. Brooks exhaled through his nose, unimpressed, already turning his attention to the next move, the next command, the next assumption, while somewhere in the distance, barely noticeable at first, the low rumble of an approaching engine began to thread its way into the silence. The low rumble grew louder, threading through the stillness until it became impossible to ignore, a deep mechanical sound that turned a few heads at the edge of the gathering crowd. But Officer Brooks did not look away from Ava, not yet, his attention fixed on her, as if the entire situation depended on holding that line, on proving something that had already been decided in his mind. "You know what happens when you lie to an officer?" he said, his voice calm but edged, the kind of calm that carried weight. Ava's grip tightened on the plastic bag, the milk shifting again with a soft slosh that echoed faintly in the quiet, her arm beginning to ache from holding it steady, but she did not lower it, did not break eye contact. Even as her heart pressed harder against her ribs, each beat measured, controlled, as if she were counting time in seconds instead of fear. "I am not lying," she answered, her voice steady but quieter now, not shrinking, just focused. Brooks tilted his head slightly, studying her face, searching for cracks, for hesitation, for anything that would confirm what he already believed. But there was none. Only a stillness that did not match her age, a composure that unsettled him more than he would admit. The crowd shifted again. A man in a baseball cap lowering his phone for a moment before raising it back up. A woman whispering something under her breath. The air carrying fragments of judgment, curiosity, doubt, all blending into a low murmur that never fully formed into words. Brooks took a small step forward, closing the distance by less than a foot, but enough to make the moment feel tighter, more contained. "You think standing there like that is going to change anything?" he asked, one eyebrow lifting slightly. Ava inhaled slowly, the cool evening air filling her lungs, steadying something inside her that had been threatening to shake loose. "I am waiting," she said, and this time there was no hesitation at all. Brooks let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, his gaze flicking briefly to the side as the sound of the approaching vehicle grew clearer, tires rolling over asphalt, smooth, deliberate, not hurried but not uncertain either. A black SUV came into view at the far end of the street, its windows tinted dark, its presence drawing attention without needing lights or noise, the kind of vehicle people noticed without knowing why. A few heads turned fully now, the murmur shifting into something sharper, more focused. But Brooks only glanced at it for a fraction of a second before looking back at Ava, dismissing it as unrelated, as background. "You should have just gone home," he said, his tone quieter now, almost as if he were offering advice instead of a warning. Ava's fingers loosened slightly on the bag, just enough to ease the strain, her other hand still gripping the strap of her backpack, the fabric pressing into her shoulder, grounding her. "I am going to," she replied, her voice calm, "with my mom." The words hung there, simple, direct, and for a brief moment, something in Brooks's expression shifted, not fully, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to register as a flicker, a pause in the certainty he had carried into the situation. The SUV slowed as it approached, the engine lowering to a near-silent hum as it pulled up along the curb a few yards away, the driver's side door still closed, the vehicle idling with a quiet authority that felt different from the police cruiser behind Brooks, different in a way that did not announce itself, but made space all the same. Ava did not turn her head, did not break her stance, her eyes still locked on the officer in front of her, but her shoulders settled slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if something unseen had shifted into place. The crowd fell quieter now, attention splitting between the officer, the girl, and the dark vehicle that had just entered. The frame, a moment stretching thin between what had been and what was about to be. Brooks finally glanced back at the SUV again, this time holding the look for a second longer, his brow tightening just a fraction, before returning his gaze to Ava. "Stay right there," he said, the command automatic, practiced, but now carrying a trace of something else beneath it, something that had not been there before, something closer to uncertainty. The engine idled with a low, steady hum that seemed to press against the silence rather than break it. The black SUV now fully settled at the curb as if it had always belonged there, its glossy surface reflecting the fading light of the sky and the faint outlines of the small crowd gathered along the sidewalk. No one speaking now, no one laughing, just watching, waiting, the shift subtle but undeniable. Officer Brooks straightened slightly without realizing it, his posture tightening as his eyes lingered on the vehicle a second longer than before, something about it pulling at his attention in a way he could not immediately place. Not fear, not yet, but recognition hovering just out of reach. "You called someone?" he asked, his voice no longer edged with amusement, but measured, cautious, as if the question mattered more than it had a moment ago. Ava did not move, her gaze still steady, her breathing even. "I told you," she said quietly, the words simple but grounded. Brooks exhaled slowly, his jaw shifting as he looked back at her, then again at the SUV, the tinted windows offering nothing in return, no movement, no silhouette, just a dark, reflective barrier that revealed only the street behind it. A passing car slowing briefly before continuing on, the distant sound of a siren somewhere blocks away, fading into the background, the world continuing beyond this moment. Even as everything here felt suspended, Brooks adjusted his stance, one foot shifting half an inch, a small movement that carried more weight than it should have. The kind of adjustment made when something unseen changes the balance of a situation. Stay right there, he repeated, though Ava had not moved, his voice firmer now, as if reinforcing control that had begun to slip at the edges. The crowd remained still, a man lowering his phone slightly, another stepping back just enough to clear the view, the air thick with anticipation that no one could quite name. The SUV's engine softened, the hum dropping lower, quieter, and then the driver's side door clicked, the sound barely audible, but sharp enough to cut through the tension like a pin dropping in a silent room. Brooks's head turned immediately this time, his eyes locking onto the door as it opened with slow precision, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, controlled, a polished black boot touched the pavement first, followed by the clean line of a dark uniform pant leg, pressed sharp, exact, every detail intentional. Brooks's breath paused for a fraction of a second, something in his chest tightening before he could understand why. The figure stepped out fully now, tall, composed, the weight of presence arriving before the face came into view, the door closing behind her with a soft, final sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Ava's shoulders eased again, just slightly, her grip on the plastic bag relaxing as the tension in her arm began to release. But she did not turn, not yet, as if she did not need to, as if the moment unfolding behind her was already certain. Brooks took a step back without realizing it, less than a foot, but enough to change the distance between him and Ava, enough for the line between authority and doubt to blur. His eyes fixed now, unblinking, as the woman from the SUV began to walk forward, each step measured, steady, the faint sound of her boots against the pavement echoing softly in the quiet street. And for the first time since the encounter began, the certainty in Officer Brooks's expression began to fracture, not shattering, not yet, but cracking just enough to let something unfamiliar through, something colder than confidence, something closer to realization. The distance between them narrowed with every step she took, not rushed, not aggressive, but certain in a way that did not ask for permission, the faint echo of her boots against the pavement settling into a steady rhythm that seemed to replace the earlier tension with something heavier, more defined. Ava finally turned her head just slightly, not fully, just enough for her eyes to find the figure approaching. And in that small movement there was no surprise, no fear, only recognition, a quiet confirmation of something she had known would happen. Sergeant Maya Johnson moved forward with a composure that did not need to announce itself. Her uniform precise, every line clean, every detail intentional, the late evening light catching the edge of her insignia and reflecting it in brief flashes that drew the eye without effort. Her gaze fixed ahead, not on the crowd, not on the cruiser, but directly on Officer Brooks, who now stood with his shoulders no longer squared in the same way, his stance adjusting again, a subtle shift of weight that betrayed the change happening beneath the surface. He did not step back this time, but he did not move forward either, caught in a space between instinct and recognition. "Ma'am," he started, the word forming automatically, reflexive, but it lacked the earlier certainty that had colored his voice. Maya stopped a few feet away, close enough for the details to sharpen, for the quiet authority she carried to become unmistakable, her presence filling the space without force, without raised tone, just by existing exactly where she stood. Ava lowered her hand slowly, the plastic bag settling at her side, the tension finally releasing from her fingers as she exhaled a breath she had been holding longer than she realized. Maya's eyes moved briefly to her daughter, a single glance, quick but full, checking, confirming. And in that moment something softer passed through her expression before. It returned to stillness, controlled, focused. "Officer," she said, her voice calm, even, carrying clearly without needing volume. Brooks blinked once, then again, his gaze shifting from her face to the insignia on her chest and back again, the pieces aligning in his mind faster now, the recognition no longer hovering just out of reach, but settling in with weight. His posture straightened again, but not in the same way as before. This time it was careful, measured. "Sergeant," he corrected himself, the word coming out slower, more deliberate, as if choosing it mattered. Maya did not nod, did not acknowledge the correction with anything more than a steady look. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. The question simple, but it landed with a precision that cut through the remaining noise of the moment. Brooks inhaled, a controlled breath, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ava, then back to Maya. The earlier confidence no longer sitting comfortably in his stance, just a routine stop. He replied, though the words felt thinner now, less anchored than before. The crowd remained silent, watching, the shift in dynamic clear even without understanding every detail. The air no longer held the same tension. It had changed shape, become something else entirely, something that placed Brooks on unfamiliar ground. Maya's gaze did not waver. "She is my daughter," she said, not as a defense, not as an explanation, but as a fact that required no embellishment. Brooks nodded once, a small movement, his jaw tightening slightly as he processed, as he recalibrated, the scene no longer fitting the pattern he had approached it with. The distance between authority and accountability narrowing in a way he could feel, but not yet fully articulate. Ava stood quietly beside them now, the grocery bag resting against her leg, her shoulders relaxed, her presence steady. No longer the center of scrutiny, but no longer alone within it either. And in the space between the three of them, something settled, not resolved, not yet, but shifting, the balance no longer where it had been moments before. The certainty replaced with a silence that carried far more weight than any raised voice ever could. The silence stretched tighter after her words, not loud, not dramatic, but dense in a way that made every small movement feel amplified. Officer Brooks shifted his weight again, the faint creak of his duty belt breaking through the stillness as his eyes moved from Maya to Ava and back, recalculating, reassessing. The earlier narrative he had built no longer fitting cleanly into what stood in front of him now. "Of course," he said finally, his tone controlled but noticeably restrained, the casual edge gone, replaced by something more deliberate, more careful, as if each word now needed to pass through a different filter before being spoken. Maya remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady without being confrontational, simply present in a way that did not allow anything to be dismissed or minimized. "Then I would like to understand what prompted this stop," she said, her voice even, measured, carrying just enough weight to make the question unavoidable. Brooks inhaled slowly, his eyes flicking briefly toward the small crowd that had not moved, their presence now heavier, more aware, phone still raised but quieter, less curious and more attentive, as if the situation had shifted from spectacle to something that required witnessing. "She was standing outside the store for a while," he began, the explanation forming carefully. "I approached to check in." The words were technically correct, but they landed differently now. Thinner, lacking the confidence they might have carried moments earlier. Ava remained silent beside her mother, her hand resting loosely at her side, the grocery bag brushing lightly against her leg with the faintest rustle whenever she adjusted her stance. Her eyes no longer fixed on Brooks, but not avoiding him either, simply present, grounded. Maya's expression did not change, but there was a slight narrowing of her eyes, not anger, not accusation, but focus. "And that required you to issue commands?" she asked, the question quiet but precise. Brooks hesitated for a fraction of a second, a pause so brief it might have gone unnoticed before, but not now, not in this stillness where every detail carried weight. "Standard procedure," he replied, though the words came slower this time, less automatic. Maya held his gaze, the space between them filled with something unspoken but unmistakable, a line drawn not in volume but in clarity. "Procedure is meant to ensure safety," she said, "not escalate uncertainty." Brooks's jaw tightened slightly, the statement landing with more force than its tone suggested. His shoulders squared again, but it was not the same stance as before, not rooted in assumption, but in an effort to regain footing. "There was no escalation," he said, though even as he spoke, his voice lacked the earlier ease, the certainty now tempered by the presence in front of him. Maya did not respond immediately, the pause stretching just long enough to let the moment settle, to let the difference between what was said and what was felt become visible without being pointed out. The crowd remained still, the quiet now deeper, more intentional. The earlier murmurs replaced by a shared awareness that something important was unfolding, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a weight that lingered, Ava shifted her grip slightly, the plastic bag crinkling softly, the sound small but grounding, a reminder of the ordinary task that had brought her here, now suspended in something far less ordinary. Maya's gaze softened briefly as it moved to her daughter again. A quick check, a silent reassurance, before returning to Brooks. "She was waiting for me," she said simply, not as an argument, not as a defense, but as a fact that reframed everything that had happened. Brooks nodded once more, slower this time. The acknowledgement no longer just procedural, but reflective, as if he were beginning to see the moment from a different angle, one that did not center his authority but questioned it. Even if only internally, the cruiser behind him hummed quietly, its presence now less dominant, less defining. The black SUV at the curb standing in contrast without needing to assert anything, and in that space between the two vehicles, between the officer and the mother, between assumption and realization, the tension did not disappear, but it changed, becoming something heavier, more honest, something that could not be dismissed with a laugh or a command, something that required an answer, whether spoken or not. The street seemed to exhale all at once, not loudly, not visibly, but in the way the tension shifted from sharp edges to something slower, heavier, like air after a storm that had not quite passed but no longer threatened to break. The faint hum of engines, both the cruiser and the SUV, blending into a low, steady backdrop that filled the silence without disturbing it. Officer Brooks lowered his gaze for a brief second, not fully, just enough to break the direct line that had defined his authority moments ago, his shoulders settling into a position that no longer pressed forward, no longer claimed space the same way, as if the ground beneath him had subtly changed shape. Maya remained where she stood, unmoving, her presence steady but no longer advancing. The distance between them now intentional, not contested. Ava shifted her weight slightly from one foot to the other, the plastic bag brushing softly against her jeans, the faint rustle almost rhythmic, grounding her in the ordinary while everything else hovered just outside of it. A loose strand of her hair lifted in the breeze, before settling back against her cheek. Unnoticed by anyone but herself, Brooks cleared his throat quietly, the sound small but distinct in the stillness. "I may have misread the situation," he said, the words careful, measured, not rushed, each one placed with an awareness that had not been there before. Maya did not interrupt, did not react immediately, allowing the statement to settle in the space between them, not accepting, not rejecting, simply letting it exist as it was. Brooks continued, his voice softer now, stripped of the earlier edge. "I was responding to what I thought was unusual behavior," he added, though even as he spoke, the explanation felt incomplete, as if he could hear it himself, the gap between intention and impact widening in real time. Ava's eyes moved briefly to her mother, not searching, not uncertain, just checking, and in that glance there was a quiet understanding, a shared recognition of something that did not need to be spoken aloud. Maya finally spoke, her tone unchanged, calm but firm in a way that did not rise or fall. "Standing outside a store is not unusual," she said, her words simple, but they carried a clarity that cut through the lingering justifications. Brooks nodded once, slower now, his lips pressing together briefly as if holding back something else, something more complicated. The crowd remained silent, but their stillness had shifted, no longer passive, no longer just observing, but aware, present in a way that made the moment feel witnessed rather than watched. A car passed at the end of the block, its headlights sweeping briefly across the scene before disappearing, leaving behind the same dim amber glow of the street lamp overhead. Ava adjusted her grip on the bag again, this time more out of habit than tension. Her arm relaxed, her shoulders no longer tight, the earlier pressure replaced with a quiet steadiness that mirrored her mother's presence beside her. Brooks took a small breath, deeper this time, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something closer to acknowledgement than defense. "I understand that now," he said, the words landing with a weight that did not need emphasis. Maya held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, not approval, not absolution, but recognition of the shift that had taken place. The line between them no longer defined by command and compliance, but by something more balanced, more accountable. The cruiser behind Brooks felt distant now, Its earlier presence diminished, while the SUV remained still, quiet, unchanged, as if it had simply marked the moment where everything had turned. Ava looked down briefly at the bag in her hand, then back up, her expression calm, composed, the earlier fear no longer visible, replaced by something quieter, something stronger. And in the space they occupied together, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy with tension. It was steady, grounded, carrying the weight of what had just shifted and what could not be undone. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled in layers, quiet and unavoidable, as Officer Brooks stood there with his gaze no longer fixed on authority, but drifting inward, piecing together something that had been buried beneath routine and assumption. His eyes flickered once more to the insignia on Maya's uniform, this time not just seeing it, but recognizing it, understanding it. The shape of memory forming behind his expression, slow but undeniable. "Johnson," he said under his breath, the name almost testing itself in the air before becoming something real. Maya's posture did not change, but there was the slightest shift in her eyes, a flicker of awareness that she had heard it, that she knew what followed next would not be about procedure or presence, but about something far more personal. Brooks's brow tightened as the pieces aligned, the quiet hum of the street fading behind the weight of recollection. A desert heat that no one else here could feel, the distant echo of radio chatter, the sharp clarity of a moment that had once defined the difference between staying and not. His breath caught briefly, not visibly to most, but enough to alter the rhythm of his stance. "You were there," he said, this time louder, but not as a statement of authority, rather as a realization he could no longer hold back. The crowd did not understand, but they felt the shift, the way the air changed again, not tense, not uncertain, but heavy with something deeper, something that reached beyond the street they stood on. Ava's eyes moved between them now, not confused, but curious, sensing the change without knowing its full shape. Maya's gaze remained steady, but softer now, not in weakness, but in recognition. "I have been in many places," she replied, her tone neutral, offering nothing more than the truth. Brooks shook his head slightly, a quiet disbelief forming in his expression as he took a small step back, this time fully aware of it. The distance no longer just physical but internal. "No," he said, more firmly now, though still without aggression. "The convoy, outside Kandahar, 2 years ago." The words came slower, deliberate, each one carrying weight, as if he were stepping back into that moment piece by piece. Maya did not respond immediately, but her eyes narrowed just slightly, searching his face now, placing him, aligning memory with present form. The silence stretched, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with recognition taking shape on both sides. Brooks exhaled, a breath he had been holding without realizing. "You pulled me out," he said, the sentence simple, but it landed with a force that shifted everything that remained. The crowd stilled further, if that was even possible, their presence now almost invisible compared to what was unfolding between the two of them. Ava's grip on the bag loosened again, her attention fully on her mother now, seeing her not just as the person who came when called, but as someone whose life extended far beyond what she had known. Maya held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a small nod, not proud, not dismissive, just acknowledging the truth of it. "I remember," she said quietly. Brooks's shoulders lowered slightly, the last remnants of his earlier posture dissolving completely, replaced by something far more human, far more exposed. "I did not recognize you," he admitted, the words carrying no defense now, only honesty. Maya did not respond with judgment, did not remind him of what had just occurred. She simply stood there, steady, allowing the weight of the realization to exist on its own, and in that moment, the power that had once belonged to uniform and command shifted entirely, no longer rooted in position, but in memory, in truth, in the quiet understanding that the person he had just questioned, just doubted, was the same one who had once ensured he had the chance to stand here at all. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with everything that had changed in a matter of seconds, everything that could no longer be undone. The words hung in the air long after he said them, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy in a way that pressed against everything around them. Officer Brooks stood there with his hands no longer resting near authority, but hanging at his sides. Open, uncertain, his gaze fixed on Maya with something that had fully replaced the confidence from before, something closer to humility, to disbelief, to the quiet weight of realizing how wrong a moment can turn when seen through the wrong lens. "I owe you my life," he said. The sentence simple, but it carried more than just gratitude. It carried the contrast between who he had been in that distant memory and who he had just been minutes ago. The gap between those two versions of himself now impossible to ignore. Maya did not react with surprise, did not step forward or soften in a way that erased what had happened. She simply held his gaze, steady, grounded, allowing the truth to sit where it belonged without amplifying it, without using it to shift the balance back in her favor. Ava looked between them again, her eyes searching her mother's face now, not for answers, but for understanding, seeing something in her that felt larger than the moment, something that connected this quiet street to places she had only ever imagined. Brooks swallowed, his throat tightening slightly as he exhaled, the sound controlled but uneven. "And I just stood here and questioned your daughter like she did not belong," he continued, the admission coming slower now, each word carrying the weight of recognition. The crowd remained silent, no longer just observers, but witnesses to something more than a simple misunderstanding, something that reached into the space between authority and accountability and exposed it in a way that could not be dismissed. Maya's expression did not harden, did not shift into judgment. Instead, it remained calm, focused, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "You did not know who I was," she said, the statement clear, factual, but not an excuse, not a release from what had occurred. Brooks nodded once, his jaw tightening again. "I should not have needed to," he replied, the sentence landing heavier than anything else he had said, the realization settling fully now, that respect, that fairness, should not depend on recognition, on history, on knowing someone's past before deciding how to treat them in the present. Ava's shoulders lifted slightly with a quiet breath, something in her posture easing even further as she listened, as she understood without needing every detail explained. Maya's gaze softened for a brief moment as it moved to her daughter again, then returned to Brooks. "What matters is what you do after you realize it," she said, her tone unchanged, not instructing, not accusing, just stating a truth that did not need emphasis. Brooks nodded again, slower this time, the motion deliberate, as if committing to something internal, something that would extend beyond this street, beyond this moment. "You are right," he said quietly, the words no longer defensive, no longer measured for appearance, but genuine in a way that did not require volume. He glanced briefly at Ava, then back to Maya, his expression steadier now, though still marked by what had shifted. "I am sorry," he added, the apology simple, direct, not wrapped in explanation or softened by justification. Just there, honest and complete. The air around them remained still, but it had changed again, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but grounded in something clearer, something more human. Ava adjusted the bag in her hand, the soft crinkle breaking the silence just enough to remind them all of where they stood, of the ordinary moment that had been interrupted and now, slowly, was returning. Maya gave a small nod, not dismissing, not fully accepting, but acknowledging the sincerity of what had been said, and in that quiet exchange, something settled between them, not erased, not forgotten, but understood in a way that could move forward without needing to look back. The crowd began to shift again, slowly, the tension dissolving into movement, into life continuing, but the space where they stood remained still just a moment longer, holding the weight of what had been said and what it meant beyond this single street corner. The moment did not end with a command or a final word. It unraveled slowly, like a breath released after being held too long. Officer Brooks stepped back fully now, not out of obligation, not as a gesture, but because the space between them had changed and he understood it without needing to be told, his hands resting at his sides, no longer signaling control, just presence, quiet and grounded. Ava shifted the bag in her hand once more, the weight of it familiar again, ordinary, the plastic pressing lightly into her fingers as she took a small step closer to her mother, not out of fear, not out of relief, but simply because that was where she belonged. Maya glanced at her briefly, her expression softening in a way that did not need words, a quiet check, a silent reassurance. Then her gaze lifted back to Brooks, steady but no longer holding him in place, just acknowledging that the moment had reached its natural end. The streetlight above flickered once before settling into a steady glow, casting a warm amber tone over the sidewalk, the reflection catching faintly on the polished surface of the SUV and the badge on Brooks's chest, two symbols of authority that now stood in quiet contrast rather than conflict. The crowd began to disperse in slow, natural movements, phones lowering, conversations returning in hushed tones, footsteps carrying people away from the edge of the moment and back into their own lives. But the weight of what they had witnessed lingered, not loud, not spoken, just present. Brooks nodded once more, a small gesture, but this time it carried something final, something resolved. "Take care," he said, his voice low, steady, no longer performing, no longer asserting, just human. Maya gave a slight nod in return, not as dismissal, not as agreement, but as recognition, the kind that did not need to stretch beyond the moment. Ava turned slightly, adjusting the strap of her backpack on her shoulder, the fabric settling into place as she exhaled softly, the tension fully gone now, replaced by a quiet steadiness that mirrored the woman beside her. The SUV door opened again with the same controlled precision as before, waiting, not urgent, not demanding, just ready. Maya placed a gentle hand on Ava's shoulder, a light touch, grounding, guiding without force, and together they began to walk toward the vehicle, their steps unhurried, aligned, the distance closing naturally as the scene behind them faded into the background. Brooks remained where he was, watching for a moment longer, not out of authority, not out of duty, but out of something quieter, something reflective, his gaze lowering briefly before lifting again, as if marking the moment in a way that would stay with him long after the street returned to normal. Ava paused just before reaching the SUV, turning her head slightly, not fully, just enough to glance back, her eyes meeting his for a brief second, not accusing, not afraid, just steady. And in that look there was something simple and clear, something that did not need explanation. Then she turned back, stepping into the vehicle as the door closed softly behind her. Maya followed, the final click of the door sealing the moment without drama. The engine remained steady, unchanged, as the SUV pulled away from the curb, smooth and quiet, blending back into the flow of the street, leaving behind the fading echo of what had happened. Brooks stood alone now beside his cruiser, the hum of its engine returning to prominence, the streetlight casting a long shadow at his feet. He adjusted his stance once more, but this time it was not about control, not about presence. It was about grounding, about standing still long enough to feel the shift that had taken place, the kind that does not show on the surface but settles deeper, reshaping something that will not return to what it was before. And as the street carried on around him, unchanged to anyone passing through, the silence that remained was no longer heavy. It was clear, steady, and quietly undeniable.